There's a term out there right now, there's a book out actually with the name of it, New Words, spiritual bypassing. And it's a term of using a spiritual affirmation or belief to bypass connection with human experience. Bypass humanity. And if Christ is divinity embracing humanity, then if we spiritually bypass, we also bypass Christ. And we maybe confuse imagination with demonstration. There's an African-American young 30-something practitioner, Christian Science practitioner. When he was in college, he presented a convocation, several students did, on the issue of race. This is an example. And he made a wonderful comment that I think has resonated with a lot who heard it for a long time. He said, when people come to me and say to me, I don't see race, I don't see color. He said, what they say to me is, I don't see you. I don't see your experience. I don't want to touch it. I'll imagine something, but I won't put it in practice. I love, anyway, this concept of moving beyond aphorisms and slogans and statements to practices. And I will say race is a fascinating subject of this. I have co-pastored 3 African-American congregations in Korea, Germany, and Florida. And I've always been enriched by the experience, but it is one of the truths that gets said, social truths, little truths, that the worship hour is the most segregated hour of the week. There's very few church congregations of any group that are truly integrated. And that's really important, I think. One of the things that unselfs our sense of love is to not project who we are on others, but to seek to understand them where they are. That's part of the love that we've been talking about today. And part of, this is New Testament stuff. You think we're never leaving the Bible here. This is the thing that almost ripped that church up, was who gets to be in, who's out. What are the membership requirements? What do you have to go through? What do you have to prove to join? And this really was the tension in Acts. And Acts sanitizes it, frankly. Read about Paul's feelings about Peter in Galatians and compare them with what Paul says, or what's said about Paul and Peter getting along in Acts. Paul got frustrated by the fact that they'd be out there in the field and Peter would look like he'd be taking big steps forward, and then he'd go back to First Church Jerusalem and it looks like he would shrink back. And Paul frustrated with that. I just put that out there because that is one of the provocative things of the New Testament that makes it so contemporary. There's nothing new for us to meet, and great guidelines there about how it's been addressed in the past. So I want you to see that, but I also going to invite the musicians here. I'm going to sing a song which is one of the leading worship songs right now in Christian churches across the country. It's been reported by different artists, but I don't think it ever sounded any better than this group. Yeah.
I want to see you.
see God and to feel seen by God. How was the experience of seeing each other in the small groups you have? Good? Good? It's just a start. But as we talked about last night, there's so much about seeing each other, listening to each other, hearing each other, paying attention to the different backgrounds that fuel a person's perspective about church, or about risk, or about tradition. That, it's part of hearing it that unselfs our own sense of love, takes the lenses off our eyes, allows us to see more clearly. But it does begin in investing a bit in the conversation. And I did talk to some of you who said, this was really great, but we just got started. I'm going to suggest you don't have to finish it. It's a great thing you could do back home. Call it a town hall meeting, don't call it a business meeting, someone will bring Robert's rules up or something. But call it something that will get people together that will, and go through some discussions and just listen. You don't have to come to an agreement. That's a really important point. I do a lot of marriage education. And one of the things about what keeps a disagreement from becoming an argument is each person feeling heard. Often when we're talking to someone else and we don't feel heard, we presume it's a volume problem. Crank up the volume. And then if you really know the other person, you know exactly the little barbs, the little comments, the little digs that will really make sure they're awake and not ignoring you. And it's just one of those devolutions that happens in sharing, but it all begins with a willingness to see each other. But there are ways that aren't as constructive to see each other, like this one.
Are you tired of small groups always getting into your business? Trying to get you to share your feelings, discuss your past, confess your sins? Are you just looking for a place to kick it, network, maybe get some free grub? Me too. That's why I created what I believe to be the world's first openly shallow small group. We're not here to deal with messy stuff like feelings and emotions. You got problems? You deal with them. You're an adult. Life ain't easy. So stop the pity party. We all have our issues. We don't really want to do life together. Frankly, at Shallow Small Group, we try not to do much of anything at all. You'll never hear us use the term unpack that thought. We're sure it's packed away for a really good reason. And you'll never hear us use the term accountability unless you're talking about someone who deals with numbers. Hey dude, thanks for doing my taxes. You have great accountability. And spiritual growth? Who wants growth? I had a growth removed last week. It wasn't pleasant. There's no pressure here to remember each other's name.
What's going on, buddy?
Oh, hey man, how's it going?
That's going good.
Hey, Chief. Oh, dude.
Captain, what's going on?
We know you have a name, and that's the important thing. Group discussion? You got tickets to the big game? Sweet. Let's spend some time on that. Oh, you and your wife are struggling financially? There's tension in the relationship? That's not really the vibe we're going for. We avoid conflict like the plague.
Who wants cake? Come on and get it!
And there will never, ever be an awkward silence. That's our guarantee to you. We hate bad theology as much as the next guy, and we know the surest way to prevent bad theology is to avoid theology altogether. And outreach? This is the only outreach you'll ever have to do. Some people say we're superficial, but hey, the word super's in superficial. I mean, who doesn't want to be super? Shallow small group, because when things get too deep, people drown. Won't you join us?
This is a big thing in this afternoon session. We're going to do a little reflection on the idea of what is happening in interpretations of Scripture today in the larger Christian realm. And small groups has been the buzzword for some time. The idea has been that even when you have a megachurch experience with all that snap, pop, and rock, snap, pop, snap, crackle, and pop. You've got all the great expression going on there of meaningfulness, in terms of the culture and everything else. The worship services are really just supposed to be an hors d'oeuvre, in a sense, to the main meal, which virtually every one of them, megachurches I've been in a number, will tell you the main meal is small groups. They want to get you in a small group where you'll have a more disciplined study, where you'll have a set of relationships, where you'll grow together and go deeper. And if the big churches can really tailor fit that to your own interests and needs. I've been to some of the big ones, and I mean, if you are a Lithuanian immigrant who likes to hook rugs and bowl, they've got a group for you. But you know, the other thing is the movement in what are called micro churches. Different than mega, micro churches. And the idea has been that these home churches, usually meeting in a home, become very intimate. And there have been several groups that have really found this interesting. This is the way Christian Science churches got started, in the home. Before there was edifice or edifice complexes, there was a home. And at that time, of course, you arrived when you could have a building. That's kind of a human construct. That may or may not say anything at all. Maybe that a wealthy donor gave you a lot of money. I don't know. But the thought would be the really essential part of a church is not the building, it is that community. And it's an easy thing, really, to develop in your home. Whether people do it through Bible study. We now have over 33 Bible studies we're aware of that are using our curriculum or doing some kind of meetings around them. And that's just one way of doing it. But finding ways to talk and be and know each other, see each other, is really important. And I actually can think of a couple instances I'm firsthand aware of people who elected to intentionally draw down from a church to a home worship. And that's just an interesting idea. A lot of them say that they find an intimacy there. That one group I knew that has been meeting the last couple of years, this is a Christian Science group. They meet Sunday mornings. They each bring different ingredients to someone's home for breakfast. They cook breakfast together. They eat the meal together. You heard about how important food and meals are for what they can represent. And then they sit around in a circle and they read the lesson and they talk about their needs, what they would like help with, and they have found a really supportive network. It's been very special to them. Just to show you that that's part of a larger trend too, of people wanting connection, wanting fellowship. So we want to file that away because we'll talk a little bit about what gets in the way of fellowship. One of the things that kind of gets in the way sometimes is this propensity to look at things through a lens that we've already established as being determinative of the experience of what it means. We see it this way, we judge it this way because we have this perspective. So I could do a couple of exercises with you that test this. This is the same thing we talked about, thumbs in the ears, singing or humming a song last night as a communication barrier. When you're talking to somebody else, it's the same thing if you do these things. If you look to Scripture for a certain thing, like how can I use Scripture to back up what I want to say in these readings? How can I use Scripture to back up what I want to say in these readings? It's really an interesting perspective that we bring. See what you think about this first little exercise. So how many of you have seen that before?
I've seen one.
Seen one like it, okay. How many of you saw, of the rest of you saw the gorilla? How many of you did not? I certainly did the first time I saw it. Isn't that interesting? You're told, programmed, expectant to look for something, and you totally miss something else. Isn't that interesting? You think if you'd been told not to look for the white shirts passing that you might have seen the gorilla? If I just played it and said, watch this, what do you see? But when our attention is directed a certain way, it's skewed. So, let's try this again. Does that seem relevant to the spiritual journey? I think it really is. You might even see something that looks to you like a failure or a defeat, as something that is really a promising step forward. And that's part of what we look for. And I'm going to invite, I think we'll have the musicians come on down. Guys, we're going to do the Lord's Prayer here. We're going to do some more music because we also find a way to look at music put together in a new and different way. This particular song presents very familiar texts, but by placing them in the way that they do, maybe they'll speak a new message. You're familiar with the text you're going to hear, but hopefully they'll speak to you in a full new way. So there is a dynamic thing happening here with the rethinking of Christianity that's going on in the world. There is a pretty broad consent among a lot of the leading thinkers in Christianity that we're at the beginning, or maybe a few years in, to a once every 500-year shift in not just religion, frankly. It's happening in politics, economics, social conditions, the sort of thing that really defines an era. A lot of people place the last shift to have been around 1517, if you want to use a marker, when Martin Luther nailed 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church and entered into what has been known now in retrospect as the Age of Modernity. Now put yourself back in 1517. That's not what Luther thought was happening at that time, right? He didn't say, we're starting a new age. But there were certain things that totally deconstructed medieval times. Now this is important. For 100 years after Luther, people continued to build medieval churches in Europe. So it doesn't stop the old way. The old process will continue, and things will go side by side. Those churches are empty today, but they were built. And the biggest thing is, in the first period of challenge, and this could be up to the first 75 years or so, according to historical periods, it's much more clear what we're not any longer than what we are. And that's generally very disconcerting, because we want to find out the fix, right? But part of it is that process of what's no longer working. And there are whole lines of discussion, and I'll be honest and candid with you, some of them are ones I've spent my lifetime perfecting. Whole patterns of thought and discussion that simply, for the coming generations, are no longer particularly relevant. They don't want to argue. They don't even see why it's important to me. That's a difference. And it's important maybe to see what's happening, because if it's present in a significant segment of the younger generations, X and Y, it certainly is present in the older generations. It just is magnified in the proportion of the younger. And you know what? I guess as I've come to see it, there are weak spots, lots of them, and failings in the shift. But you know what? There are weak spots and failings in our modern times as well. It isn't really a question about whether one's good or bad. It's kind of looking at, well, one is, and do you want to talk to it? Do you want to have engagement with it? And I think that's one of the things that people are talking about when they speak of the things Jonathan worked with this morning with us about being vulnerable, being real, being authentic. But in the doctrinal issues, these are the kind of things that are being talked about. How many of you have heard of Rob Bell? Okay, just Kim Shippey reviewed him in the Christian Science Sentinel. I read Kim for years and appreciate his insights. And I've never seen Kim quite as enthusiastic about something as a talk he heard Rob Bell give, full of healings, he says, at the Trinity Church, not too far from the Christian Science Plaza in Boston. And I thought you might want to see Rob Bell. He was on the cover a year ago this month. He was on the cover of Time magazine for his new book, Love Wins. And in it, he really suggests that this whole hell issue is not an issue. Think about that for a minute. You have religious traditions and professionals who have spent their lifetime perfecting messages designed to keep people from going to hell, and if you tell them there's no hell, what are you talking about? Let's meet Rob, and hear his little message here.
Several years ago, we had an art show at our church, and people brought in all kinds of sculptures and paintings, and we put them on display, and there was this one piece that had a quote from Gandhi in it. And lots of people found this piece compelling. They'd stop and sort of stare at it and take it in and reflect on it, but not everybody found it that compelling. Somewhere in the course of the art show, somebody attached a handwritten note to the piece, and on the note, they had written, "Reality check, he's in hell." Gandhi's in hell? He is? And someone knows this for sure and felt the need to let the rest of us know? Will only a few select people make it to heaven? And will billions and billions of people burn forever in hell? And if that's the case, how do you become one of the few? Is it what you believe or what you say or what you do or who you know or something that happens in your heart? Or do you need to be initiated or baptized or take a class or converted or being born again? How does one become one of these few? And then there is the question behind the questions, the real question: what is God like? Because millions and millions of people were taught that the primary message, the center of the gospel of Jesus, is that God is going to send you to hell unless you believe in Jesus. And so what gets subtly sort of caught and taught is that Jesus rescues you from God. But what kind of God is that we would need to be rescued from this God? How could that God ever be good? How could that God ever be trusted? And how could that ever be good news? This is why lots of people want nothing to do with the Christian faith. They see it as an endless list of absurdities and inconsistencies, and they say, why would I ever want to be a part of that? See, what we believe about heaven and hell is incredibly important because it exposes what we believe about who God is and what God is like. What you discover in the Bible is so surprising, unexpected, and beautiful that whatever we've been told or taught, the good news is actually better than that, better than we could ever imagine. The good news is that love wins.
This young pastor had a large church, about 10,000 member mega church up in Michigan called Mars Hill. Interesting title. He's left that church now, carrying this message forward. He's been absolutely crucified. Absolutely crucified. As much because he was part of the hope of the next generation of evangelical leaders, and now he's undermined, in their minds, the message. And interestingly, he's not trying at this point anyway, maybe next week, I don't know, but he's not trying to start a new church. I've spent a fair amount of time as I'm trying to rethink things and think more broadly about what a Bible program and weekend might look like, aimed at a wider audience. With Mary Baker Eddy's definition of church in Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, and in particular, one word. The word whatever. Whatever rests upon and proceeds from divine control. Found rousing and dormant understanding. Whatever. Maybe a church, as we conceive of it, is not the primary thing. I know more next-gen folks who are taking their spirituality into changing the design of workplaces. I know one Christian Science woman in her mid-30s with whom I'm doing some work for her organization, actually, who's got this dynamic design of making freedom democracy in the workplace that would empower workers, would give management more flexibility. And she, interestingly, she's been working on this for years, and has getting more and more allies coming to her, including an increasing number of what we would call the next-gen companies. You might know some of these, you've heard of them, Zappos. Zappos Workplace is now a leading tourist attraction in Las Vegas, their headquarters, to see the workplace. And they're moving it from outside downtown to the old downtown of Las Vegas and becoming part of a solution to that community's issues. Hulu, Groupon. It's just fascinating. And I can think of a couple others like that who are doing so many things. The whatever allows for church to happen in a lot of different ways. Now, as much as Rob makes his point here, Rob's a younger guy. I was in a conference at Eaton Theological Seminary in St. Louis with about 350 clergy. It was their annual kind of alumni thing, and I'm not an alum, but I did go to this talk because Phyllis Tickle was talking. And maybe you've heard of Phyllis Tickle. Good. Wrote a book called The Great Emergence, as well as a number of others. Phyllis is not this Gen Y. She's the ultimate kind of Mid-South Tennessee grandmother. She's just, it's great. She took the lectern She leaned over the lectern, never looked at a note, spoke for an hour and a half to all these distinguished guests. We went to lunch. She came back, spoke to another hour and a half. And in this great emergence, where she defines the shift, the change in Christianity, this is the kind of stuff she laid on them. She's highly respected. She said, I hate to tell you this. I don't want to tell you this, but I've got to tell you this. Your doctrine of atonement, it ain't working anymore. She said, there's no way that an omniscient God can't figure out how to deal with your sin besides killing his own son. And she said, we don't need that kind of daddy. But think back what this means. What have you been trained to do if you're a minister? These weren't necessarily fundamentalists or ministers, but I mean, the fundamental thing is the doctrine of atonement. How Christ's death and blood atone for one's sin. And now again, you shouldn't be talking about it that way. And what I would have us pull out of these two examples of Rob and Phyllis, of different generations and genders, different backgrounds, is look at how hard others are working. And what might we need to work at with the same amount of diligence and effort? I think that's very provocative. How much of what we accept as culture and tradition. I will say that I don't do a lot of the denominational discussion here because I am trying to make our message increasingly universal, broad. But the Mary Baker Eddy Library has given us so much more information of Mary Baker Eddy in her own words. And we're finding a lot of new things out about what mattered to her and what wasn't so important to her. And the discussions that the library researchers and staff have done at the recent Church Alive summits, you can listen to some of them on the website, but Mike Davis is in particular, their lead researcher, is just amazing. And then the question is, are we willing as good scientists? What do scientists do? They experiment? How do you have a scientist who doesn't experiment? Miss A talked at one point, we have this language now, that she saw her life as one of a great experimenter. Where did we become so risk adverse? And how do we find the boldness, which the New Testament encourages us to do, to not confuse divine perfection with human perfectionism and a great fear of not looking all together? People really aren't looking for people who look all together. In fact, if anything today, our society teaches us to be suspect of people who present themselves as having no problems. And that's pretty important, because what they're looking for, the things we've been talking about in Thrive, because we see it central to the Scripture, is authenticity, genuineness, not human ability but divine grace, willingness to use gifts, not to use the Spirit or the religion. Think about this for a moment. Using Christian Science. Miss A never uses that term. If Christian Science is the comforter, do you feel comfortable saying using the comforter? Isn't the role of our relation with the comforter really to fit ourselves to be more used by her? It sounds to me, people, like we have a technique. And it's about human thoughts. If I have my right, I have to get my thoughts, my thinking cleared up, and so if I don't have a problem fixed, it must be my thinking. There's all kinds of things that go with this, as opposed to a divine thrust like the Bible talks about repeatedly. It's God's grace, God's love, and what blocks us from feeling that. Part of it is this rugged sense of self-sufficiency that doesn't leave a lot of room in the glass for God. And that's part of our journey here. I'm going to play a clip from you, a TED Talk. How many of you are familiar with TED Talks? Good, right? You know, the Mother Church is designing a number of Christian Science lectures to follow that format. They're very popular. Our Midwest Bible Conference at Cedars Camps this September is going to feature a number of TED Talks from our Bible faculty. It is definitely the way people are taking it. This one is not from a Bible scholar. And I haven't shown it in a Thrive yet, but I showed it at both conferences this past summer, and I got more comments on it. And I'm not trying to be solicitous of you all, but some of the levels of discussion we've heard today show me a group that might really benefit from this, because you're already pressing at a lot of the points that this speaker tends to address. She is a sociology professor, and she's going to talk to you about some of the things we've been discussing, the ideas of vulnerability, authenticity, wholeheartedness. And I will say the Christian Science audiences who have heard this have really, really loved it. So it's about 18 minutes, and I'm kind of investing a lot of time in this because I think it is worth the effort. I think you will appreciate it.
So I'll start with this. A couple of years ago, an event planner called me because I was going to do a speaking event. And she called and she said, I'm really struggling with how to write about you on the little flyer. And I thought, well, what's the struggle? And she said, well, I saw you speak, and I'm going to call you a researcher, I think, but I'm afraid if I call you a researcher, no one will come because they'll think you're boring and irrelevant. And I was like, okay. And she said, but the thing I liked about your talk is, you're a storyteller, so I think what I'll do is just call you a storyteller. And of course, the academic, insecure part of me was like, you're going to call me a what? And she said, I'm going to call you a storyteller. And I was like, oh, why not Magic Pixie? I was like, let me think about this for a second. And so I tried to call deep on my courage, and I thought, I am a storyteller. I'm a qualitative researcher. I collect stories. That's what I do. And maybe stories are just data with a soul, and maybe I'm just a storyteller. So I said, you know what? Why don't you just say I'm a researcher storyteller? And she went, there's no such thing. So I'm a researcher storyteller. And I'm going to talk to you today. We're talking about expanding perception. And so I want to talk to you and tell some stories about a piece of my research that fundamentally expanded my perception and really actually changed the way that I live and love and work and parent. And this is where my story starts. When I was a young researcher, doctoral student, my first year I had a research professor who said to us, here's the thing, if you cannot measure it, it does not exist. And I thought he was just sweet-talking me. I was like, really? And he's like, absolutely. So you have to understand that I have a bachelor's in social work, a master's in social work, and I was getting my PhD in social work. So my entire academic career was surrounded by people who kind of believed in the life's messy, love it, and I'm more the life's messy, clean it up, organize it, and put it into a bento box. And so to think that I had found my way, to found a career that takes me, really one of the big sayings in social work is lean into the discomfort of the work. And I'm like, knock discomfort upside the head and move it over and get all A's. That was my mantra. So I was very excited about this. And so I thought, you know what? This is the career for me because I am interested in some messy topics, but I want to be able to make them not messy. I want to understand them. I want to hack into these things I know are important and lay the code out for everyone to see. So where I started was with connection, because by the time you're a social worker for 10 years, what you realize is that connection is why we're here. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. This is what it's all about. It doesn't matter whether you talk to people who work in social justice and mental health and abuse and neglect. What we know is that connection, the ability to feel connected, is neurobiologically, that's how we're wired, it's why we're here. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to start with connection. Well, you know that situation where you get an evaluation from your boss and she tells you 37 things that you do really awesome and one thing that you can't, an opportunity for growth. And all you can think about is that opportunity for growth, right? Well, apparently this is the way my work went as well, because when you ask people about love, they tell you about heartbreak. When you ask people about belonging, they'll tell you their most excruciating experiences of being excluded. And when you ask people about connection, the stories they told me were about disconnection. So very quickly, really about 6 weeks into this research, I ran into this unnamed thing that absolutely unraveled connection in a way that I didn't understand or had never seen. And so I pulled back out of the research and thought, I need to figure out what this is. And it turned out to be shame. And shame is really easily understood as the fear of disconnection. Is there something about me that if other people know it or see it, that I won't be worthy of connection? The things I can tell you about it, it's universal. We all have it. The only people who don't experience shame have no capacity for human empathy or connection. No one wants to talk about it, and the less you talk about it, the more you have it. What underpinned this shame, this I'm not good enough, which we all know that feeling, I'm not blank enough, I'm not thin enough, rich enough, beautiful enough, smart enough, promoted enough. The thing that underpinned this was excruciating vulnerability. This idea of, in order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen, really seen. And you know how I feel about vulnerability. I hate vulnerability. And so I thought, this is my chance to beat it back with my measuring stick. I'm going in, I'm going to figure this stuff out, I'm going to spend a year, I'm going to totally deconstruct shame, I'm going to understand how vulnerability works, and I'm going to outsmart it. So I was ready, and I was really excited. As you know, it's not going to turn out well. You know this. So I could tell you a lot about shame, but I'd have to borrow everyone else's time. But here's what I can tell you that it boils down to. And this may be one of the most important things that I've ever learned in the decade of doing this research. My 1 year has turned into 6 years, thousands of stories, hundreds of long interviews, focus groups. At one point, people were sending me journal pages and sending me their stories, thousands of pieces of data. And 6 years. And I kind of got a handle on it. I kind of understood this is what shame is, this is how it works. I wrote a book, I published a theory, but something was not okay. And what it was is that if I roughly took the people I interviewed and divided them into people who really have a sense of worthiness, that's what this comes down to, a sense of worthiness. They have a strong sense of love and belonging. And folks who struggle for it, and folks who are always wondering if they're good enough. There was only one variable that separated the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging and the people who really struggle for it, and that was the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging believe they're worthy of love and belonging. That's it. They believe they're worthy. And to me, the hard part of the one thing that keeps us out of connection is our fear that we're not worthy of connection, was something that personally and professionally I felt like I needed to understand better. So what I did is I took all of the interviews where I saw worthiness, where I saw people living that way, and just looked at those. What do these people have in common? And I have a slight office supply addiction, but that's another talk. So I had a manila notebook, a manila folder, and I had a Sharpie, and I was like, what am I going to call this research? And the first words that came to my mind were wholehearted. These are kind of wholehearted people living from this deep sense of worthiness. So I wrote at the top of the manila folder, and I started looking at the data. In fact, I did it first in this in a 4-day, very intensive data analysis where I went back, pulled these interviews, pulled the stories, pulled the incidents. What's the theme? What's the pattern? My husband left town with the kids because I always go into this kind of Jackson Pollock crazy thing where I'm just like writing and going and kind of just in my researcher mode. And so here's what I found. What they had in common was a sense of courage. And I want to separate courage and bravery for you for a minute. Courage, the original definition of courage, when it first came into the English language, it's from the Latin word cur, meaning heart. And the original definition was to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. And so these folks had, very simply, the courage to be imperfect. They had the compassion to be kind to themselves first and then to others, because as it turns out, we can't practice compassion with other people if we can't treat ourselves kindly. And the last was they had connection, and this was the hard part, as a result of authenticity. They were willing to let go of who they thought they should be in order to be who they were, which is, you have to absolutely do that for connection. The other thing that they had in common was this. They fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. They didn't talk about vulnerability being comfortable, nor did they really talk about it being excruciating, as I had heard earlier in the shame interviewing. They just talked about it being necessary. They talked about the willingness to say, I love you first. The willingness to do something where there are no guarantees. The willingness to breathe through waiting for the doctor to call after your mammogram. The willing to invest in a relationship that may or may not work out. They thought this was fundamental. I personally thought it was betrayal. I could not believe I had pledged allegiance to research, where our job, the definition of research is to control and predict, to study phenomenon for the explicit reason to control and predict. And now my mission to control and predict had turned up the answer that the way to live is with vulnerability and to stop controlling and predicting. This led to a little breakdown, which actually looked more like this. And it did. It led to I call it a breakdown, my therapist calls it a spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening sounds better than breakdown, but I assure you it was a breakdown. And I had to put my data away and go find a therapist. Let me tell you something. You know who you are when you call your friends and say, I think I need to see somebody. Do you have any recommendations? Because about 5 of my friends are like, woo, I wouldn't want to be your therapist. And I was like, what does that mean? And they're like, I'm just saying, don't bring your measuring stick. It's like, okay. So I found a therapist. My first meeting with her, Diana, I brought in my list of the way the wholehearted live. And I sat down, and she said, how are you? And I said, I'm great, I'm okay. And she said, what's going on? And I said, and this is a therapist who sees therapists, because we have to go to those because their BS meters are good. And so I said, here's the thing, I'm struggling. And she said, what's the struggle? And I said, well, I have a vulnerability issue, and I know that vulnerability is kind of the core of shame and fear and our struggle for worthiness, but it appears that it's also the birthplace of joy, of creativity, of belonging, of love, and I think I have a problem, and I need some help. And I said, but here's the thing, no family stuff, no childhood shit, I just need some strategies. Thank you. So she goes like this. And then I said, it's bad, right? And she said, it's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. And I said, oh my God, this is gonna suck. And it did, and it didn't. And it took about a year. And you know how there are people that, like, when they realize that vulnerability and tenderness are important, that they kind of surrender and walk into it? A, that's not me. And B, I don't even hang out with people like that. For me, it was a year-long street fight. It was a slugfest. Vulnerability pushed, I pushed back. I lost. the fight, but probably won my life back. And so then I went back into the research and spent the next couple of years really trying to understand what they, the wholehearted, what the choices they were making, and what are we doing with vulnerability? Why do we struggle with it so much? Am I alone in struggling with vulnerability? No. So this is what I learned. We numb vulnerability. When we're waiting for the call, it was funny, I sent something out on Twitter and on Facebook that says, how would you define vulnerability? What makes you feel vulnerable? And within an hour and a half, I had 150 responses. Because I wanted to know, what's out there. Having to ask my husband for help because I'm sick and we're newly married. Initiating sex with my husband. Initiating sex with my wife. Being turned down. Asking someone out. Waiting for the doctor to call back, getting laid off, laying off people. This is the world we live in. We live in a vulnerable world. And one of the ways we deal with it is we numb vulnerability. And I think there's evidence, and it's not the only reason this evidence exists, but I think that it's a huge cause. We are the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in U.S. history. The problem is, and I learned this from the research, that you cannot selectively numb emotion. You can't say, here's the bad stuff. Here's vulnerability, here's grief, here's shame, here's fear, here's disappointment. I don't want to feel these. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. I don't want to feel these. And I know that's knowing laughter. I hack into your lives for a living. I know that's, God. You can't numb those hard feelings without numbing the other affects or emotions. You cannot selectively numb. So when we numb those, we numb joy. We numb gratitude. We numb happiness. And then we are miserable, and we are looking for purpose and meaning. And then we feel vulnerable, so then we have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. And it becomes this dangerous cycle. One of the things that I think that we need to think about is why and how we numb. And it doesn't just have to be addiction. The other thing we do is we make everything that's uncertain, certain. Religion has gone from a belief in faith and mystery to certainty. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. That's it. Just certain. The more afraid we are, the more vulnerable we are, the more afraid we are. This is what politics looks like today. There's no discourse anymore. There's no conversation. There's just blame. You know how blame is described in the research? A way to discharge pain and discomfort. We perfect. If there's anyone who wants their life to look like this, it would be me. But it doesn't work, because what we do is we take fat from our butts and put it in our cheeks. Which just, I hope in 100 years people will look back and go, wow. And we perfect, most dangerously, our children. Let me tell you what we think about children. They're hardwired for struggle when they get here. When you hold those perfect little babies in your hand, our job is not to say, look at her, she's perfect. My job is just to keep her perfect, make sure she makes the tennis team by 5th grade and Yale by 7th grade. That's not our job. Our job is to look and say, you know what? You're imperfect and you're wired for struggle, but you are worthy of love and belonging. That's our job. Show me a generation of kids raised like that and we'll end the problems I think that we see today. We pretend that what we do doesn't have an effect on people. We do that in our personal lives. We do that corporate, whether it's a bailout, an oil spill, a recall. We pretend like what we're doing doesn't have a huge impact on other people. I would say to companies, this is not our first rodeo, people. We just need you to be authentic and real and say, we're sorry, we'll fix it. But there's another way, and I'll leave you with this. This is what I have found. To let ourselves be seen, deeply seen, vulnerably seen. to love with our whole hearts, even though there's no guarantee. And that's really hard, and I can tell you as a parent, that's excruciatingly difficult. To practice gratitude and joy in those moments of kind of terror when we're wondering, can I love you this much? Can I believe in this passionately? Can I be this fierce about this? Just to be able to stop and instead of catastrophizing what might happen, to say, I'm just so grateful, because to feel this vulnerable means I'm alive. And the last, which I think is probably the most important, is to believe that we're enough. Because when we work from a place, I believe, that says, I'm enough, then we stop screaming and start listening. We're kinder and gentler to the people around us, and we're kinder and gentler to ourselves. That's all I have. Thank you.
What do you think? What? Was it time well spent? There's so much to unpack in there, so much to listen to. And maybe it brings a new cast to this idea of why some people are so resistant of religious belief systems. You hear the term today, I'm spiritual, not religious. There's new studies out there all the time trying to figure out what do they mean by spiritual. There's one study out that says 43% of all people who say they're spiritual are primarily saying they care about the environment. I don't know if that's true or not. But it says we're trying to struggle and reach for something. But remember what we said at the outset? It's most clear at the outset what we don't want to be than what we're becoming. And I think maybe before we say that people really have a comprehensive idea of what spiritual means, and I think there is some reaching towards it, I think they're saying very clearly what they don't want to be. And that's part of a system that judges others, that makes people feel shame or guilt as a vehicle for certain behaviors, that makes black and white choices, that sole sources inspiration coming through one vehicle, one channel, one method, one approach, and doesn't recognize the things we're talking about, of vulnerability. And I don't know what would be a better demonstration of vulnerability than what Jesus is willing to surrender himself to in the garden. Even if you don't believe the idea, I'm sure you do, but most people don't believe that he could have prayed, and as he said, and brought down a legion of angels. He simply had to go out the back door of the garden. You know, all the lights are coming from one direction. It's dark out. They're way out there. All he's got to do is go out the back door, cross the little brook, up the hillside to the ridgeline, and in a few minutes he's down in Bethany at Martha, Mary, and Lazarus' house having hot chocolate. He could have avoided the whole thing. He could have stayed in Galilee. Could have written a book, done a show. Could have done the whole thing. Healed so many people, left so many more teachings. But the people at that point were piqued as to where they could go as long as they were looking at him. Because they weren't looking at themselves or their own relationship with the Comforter. He says to that to them. If I don't go, the Comforter won't come. I don't know if that's altogether the fact that it won't come, or you wouldn't see her if you did. If she did. But the point is that he demonstrates a willingness to be vulnerable in which they feel vulnerable. The exact opposite of the prideful people who tried to build the Tower of Babel and get their way up to God by their own strength, their own will, for their own purposes. Because to use God to get what they want. That's what happens with the snake in the garden. Tells Adam and Eve, you can use this fruit to be like God. You can have God's power. Not his responsibility. You wouldn't want that. But you have his power. And that's the myth all the way through. Will you use God, use religion, or allow yourself to be used by grace? We use that term a lot. It's a powerful term. It's one word that a lot of people are identifying today that they're more comfortable with than God. Spiritual life programs I see that talk about grace where we would have said God. Grace is this rich definition of God, but beautifully in Mary Baker Eddy's descriptions of it, but also in every author I've read, Philip Yancey and others that have been so articulate on the subject, they don't try and tell you in 500 words what it means. They try to show you what it looks like. Remember Mary Baker Eddy on this point? On page 4 of Science and Health, when she tells you about what we most need? prayer of fervent desire for growth in grace. And grace means, no, expressed in, it looks like this: patience, meekness, love, and good deeds. So we're going to close out this afternoon session with a song on grace. What are the parts of Mark's gospel, as a one you can just basically sit down and read in one sitting, that we skip over because they're awkward, or ones we didn't even know were awkward? For instance, I just talked about vulnerability. In the gospel story that you know, what is the solution to Jesus' vulnerability? His death on the cross. What do you know to be the answer, the rest of the story? Resurrection. What do you do with the oldest scrolls of Mark that don't have that resurrection narrative? Pardon? Add it on? Well, we see it, you'll see it in almost many Bibles. I'll tell you, verses 9 through 16 of the 16th chapter of Mark is from a later scroll. And it's like, the early version, that is the earliest gospel we have, does not have the resurrection story as the end. So what is your faith? It's born of vulnerability, isn't it? But God's ability. And I think, but it's really interesting. It leaves off saying, and they were all afraid. That's really interesting. Think of it. And it looks like most scholars believe that, well, she'll talk to you about it. I won't spoil her story. But that's a really great point. So let's talk about grace. Let's hear about grace one more time. Thank you.